Hello everyone, welcome to the second session of these. We're delighted that you can be with us today. Do wish I'd ironed my shirt now, but please excuse me anyway. It's great to see so many of you back today. I can see some familiar names in the chat and also some new people as well, so that's really good. I'm just going to stall for a couple of minutes while we get some more people online, because we've got a few kind of latecomers, as you would normally expect. Whilst I do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about ACAM, and then I will introduce Joanna. So we are ACAM. We are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health. We're a mental health charity, obviously. And we've been established for over 60 years. Now, primarily, we're an academic association, membership organisation, but we also have more people joining and accessing the resources that we put online from all areas of the community, particularly those that have a continual dealing with children. So as well as academics, clinicians and researchers, that might be social workers and teachers. And obviously today I see we've got a lot of people here that are from the fire service, obviously, because this is what we're talking about today. So as a charity, we don't actually receive any government funding, nor do we solicit donations. Our business model is based on our academic journals. We have 3 academic journals. People pay to go on those, and institutions pay to access those. We also run a membership scheme, so anyone can join. There's a concessionary rate that starts at £35, and there's an online rate which starts at £50, and then there's a printed rate, which basically means you get printed copies of the journals. So everyone here today that is a member will be able to access a CPD learning certificate for their time here. And also we have a whole series of past lectures and talks that people can access on demand. And all members need to do is just drop us an email and we'll give you a CPD certificate for that. So if you're not a member, you can still access our resources. That's yeah, absolutely fantastic. That's what we want to do. We want to bridge that gap between evidence research and clinical practice. So that would be kind of fantastic. If you are interested in joining ACAM, you'll get an automated email in the next few days to show when we have got the session up online. And we'll give you a little discount code as well. And I'll put that in the chat later on today during the break. And that will reduce the membership cost down to £50 a year, which works out at less than 8p a day. So that's a pretty good deal, I think. But I would say that, wouldn't I? So we are 3 minutes in. So what we're going to do here, I've posted some details in the chat about last week's session that was online. So you'll be able to access that as well. And I think we should have a transcript of that session being posted online very soon as well. What we'll do now is give you the opportunity to ask questions. Sorry, you'll be able to ask questions throughout this session to Joanna, and then we'll be able to field those at the end. So you can use the Q&A facility, and obviously you can use the chat facility. So just for those that are new to kind of Zoom, this is a webinar, so you can see us, but we can't see you and we can't hear you. So if you do have any technical difficulties, put the difficulties that you're having in the chat, and we'll try to resolve those. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to introduce Joanna to you, and we can get on with the session. So Joanna is an Oxford graduate and also has a postgraduate in child and adolescent and family mental health, and recently completed a master's in applied criminology, penology and management at Cambridge. She has over 16 years experience of working in the public, charitable and voluntary sectors, including 10 years managing the London Fire Brigade's Juvenile Fire Setters Intervention Scheme. It's easy for me to say. Joanna worked closely with the London Child Protection Committee to introduce juvenile file-setting behaviour into the London Child Protection procedures for the very first time. She's launched Fabtic, a company specialising in juvenile file-setting behaviour, in 2013 and delivers training, consultancy and supervision services to frontline practitioners. Her work is featured in a host of mainstream media, including the BBC and Financial Times, and she has spoken at conferences all over the world on juvenile fire setting and children's safeguarding. And we're absolutely delighted to have her here for the second day. You're going to have a fantastic session, so do enjoy it. So Joanna, it's over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt, and to everyone who is here. Uniquely, it's really brilliant, beautiful sunshine in the UK at the moment. So I am so impressed people are dedicating a Friday afternoon to be learning through a screen. Our last webinar, nearly 700 people signed up, and we had representation from practitioners, clinicians, academics, researchers, parents and carers from 40 different countries, that's 40, and 6 of the 7 world continents. And even though it is through a screen and I can't see you, the fact that for today's webinar, over 700 people have signed up this time to watch later the recording through a screen, this still feels an incredibly nurturing space and an opportunity for growth. And it gives me hope about the change that can happen in this field of work, given that there are so many people from so many disciplines across so many different locations interested in this subject, working in this field and clearly wanting to be the best we can be, and here prepared to learn, potentially be challenged and have a discussion. The volume means that, yes, it's a webinar, not a workshop as the original intention. So the conversations are through the Q&A or the chat box. But those of you here last time, Matt did an outstanding job of going through the questions. And what we do is we let them come through as I speak. And then in the break time, I will look at them, and then again at the end in our Q&A session. Otherwise, it's simply too distracting if I try and do questions and the presentation at the same time. Talking of presentations, I'll now start to share my screen. A little like last time, what a short, easy conversation we need to have in 2 hours. When Matt understandably struggled with London Fire Brigade's Juvenile Fire Setting Intervention Scheme, now get your head around fire safety education, psychosocial interventions, and what works in addressing child set fires. So very much like the first webinar, there'll be much here that fuels our future conversations and questions in this field. There is only so much we can explore in 2 hours and within the limited research available, but this is the heart of what we are thinking about today. Mindful that nobody could be at both sessions, people weren't able to be here last week and last time rather, I thought it useful to start with a summary of what did we explore the last time. Hopefully it's not too much of a Groundhog Day for those who were here. That in itself, I think, is a lesson straight away about when we work with children and young people. So an emphasis today is very much on the practical application of our research, the strategies we use, the resources. Just how much do our children and young people remember from the last time they were with us? Who we are, why we are there, how long we're working with them for now and in the future. So it's no bad thing to think about, yes, how do we do summaries for our children and young people? Do we ask them, what do you remember from last time we were here? Maybe for some of us, it's really obvious, it's in our repertoire, but busy people sometimes take our eyes off the ball of the basics about who we are, why we are there, and what we will do. So taking you back to 2 weeks ago, and again, mindful of our international audience, in the UK, we also call 2 weeks a fortnight, the Old English of 14 nights. So we've had 14 sleeps since we were together last. What do we remember? So I started by grounding very much our conversations in the consideration of why language matters, the power of language, how we use it, what we write, and linking it directly to my discipline and the lens and context I use for this work, which is all around criminology, constructs of crime, how we respond to crime as a society, and how we try to prevent further crime and offending behaviour. Not all children and teenagers setting fires are committing criminal acts, but we can certainly think of the behaviour as offending, certainly risk critical. So what can criminology teach us? And the desistance literature around language teaches us that how a person sees themselves will influence behaviour, and indeed any behaviour change. And so if we talk about our children and young people as fire setters, offenders, they hear themselves spoken about in that way, they read about themselves in that way, then do they get a sense of themselves as anything other than their worst behaviour? I linked this with labelling theory and how our children will often live up to the worst expectations. And so is why I will always say children who set fires, adolescents with fire setting behaviour. I take out of my language the phrase fire setters and arsonists, not to in any way belittle the seriousness of a behaviour, but to ensure my language is more than a reflection of someone's worst action. We then started to think of the fire setting literature specifically, and what does it tell us about children who set fires? What do we know? So in the research, it establishes that many children setting fires have complex trauma in their histories and of course their current being. And also there are characteristics of impulsivity. We have higher levels of ADHD amongst children who set fires when compared with other children who have ADHD and other behavioural problems, but not fire setting behaviour. Our children setting fires have higher levels of emotional dysregulation compared to children who don't set fires. Children setting fires, again, greater prevalence of mental health disorders when compared to children who do not set fires. Our children and teenagers setting fires are often aggressive and much more so when compared to children and teenagers with antisocial behaviours. And so we start to build a picture that fire-setting behaviour is more than an antisocial behaviour, that fire-setting often serves a higher functioning for our children and teenagers, whether that's about expressive communication or the expression of feelings. Also on top of that, we layer, of course, a fire interest and a fire access and exposure within the home. So we start to think, of course, more widely than the child themselves and what's the home environment. And there, the literature teaches us that families often have their own multiple stressors, which includes conflict between partners. Parents and carers who have their own limited fire safety education, homes where there's often harsh discipline and little guidance and supervision. So the opportunity and the access to set fires, the exposure. And this brought us to the consideration of the three broad domains of risk factors for fire setting behaviour by children, which is about fire interest, access, exposure. So our questions will be all around the fires that have been set. Where, when, Who is the person with, on their own or with others? Where are they setting fires? What are they setting fire to? Trying to establish patterns around interest and exposure and access. A major risk factor that whatever our discipline, we are thinking about in our work. Of course, then alongside that, we're thinking of the child, their individual functioning, and the areas I've talked about already around mental health, their emotional regulation. Are there additional disorders? Is this a child with autism or ADHD? And is maybe even age a consideration in their ability to function and think? Our 4-year-old who is able to set a fire is going to respond and act very differently to a typical 14-year-old who sets a fire. And so our risk around harm and fatalities are heightened for the younger a child is playing or setting fires. We, of course, then think family, and again, those areas touched on already. What is happening within this family? Their stresses, what's their understanding of fire safety? And we've moved along to think about fire setting as a spectrum. That's a phrase we hear quite typically when thinking of children with autism. We'll think of a spectrum. And I encourage the idea of thinking of using the literature and research to guide us in thinking of fire setting behaviour as a spectrum. That at the start of the spectrum is curiosity fire setting, maybe very young children, or indeed our teenagers who've seen something in the chemistry lab in school or on TikTok or social media, and they want to find out, how does this work, gain mastery over this potential new skill? Then there are those children setting fires where we thought of terms like an expressive type of fire setting, our cry for help, our attachment needing and attachment seeking children. What does a fire communicate that words perhaps can't? Establishing, of course, that all behaviour is communication, and we really listen to fire setting and what that might be telling us on what's going on in this child's world. Moving through the spectrum, we reach our teenagers. The terminology we looked at was delinquent. So again, we thought about language. We would never describe anyone as, oh, you're a delinquent fire setter, where's the hope? How do you be anything other than a delinquent if that's what you're described by professionals with big books and big names and many letters after their names, or uniforms, or maybe even both? And so we think of the spectrum with caution when we consider classifications, because no classifications or typologies are universally tested or empirically accepted. But if we're trying to take all this literature and use it in a practicable way, then typologies can at least give us this notion of, where is this child or teenager on their spectrum of fire setting? Has it been a linear development through, or do they suddenly seem to be at the stage of using fire to communicate feelings and emotions without curiosity as a younger child? And then reaching the final classification within the spectrum, which again, the language of the research at the time talks about severely disturbed fire setting or pathological fire setting, where of course we are thinking about a child or teenager with other pathologies, other mental health needs, that of course then start to make us think about responses, resources, who is the team around this child and family, what expertise is needed from whom to make sure this child and those around them are as safe as they can be. In the absence of assessment frameworks, in the absence of national guidelines, this is very much relying on professional judgment, clinical expertise and experience. And we look to what guidance is available in terms of the literature. And I introduced people to the work of Kolko and Wernberg and their practitioner guide. You'll see it again today, and how they talk about a hierarchy of interventions. So we take the characteristics, we take the risk factors, we think of the classifications and spectrum, and start to wonder, what's the hierarchy of intervention required? What's the response? Kolko and Wernberg speak to 6 types of intervention, starting absolutely with the fundamental of the child or teenager's environment, what's their access, what is their exposure, what's the opportunity to set fires. We move through and start to think about the importance of fire safety education, and then we'll start to consider additional support like psychosocial interventions, what we're thinking about here today, fire safety education and cognitive behavioural treatments. And of course, along the interventions, there might be the requirement for youth justice, and indeed, are we reaching the very end of the hierarchy of interventions where the decision has to be taken that for this child to be as safe as they can be, they need to be removed from their current home. And many of you on screen, like me, will have worked with too many children who've needed to be removed from home. It doesn't mean our other work stops. It doesn't mean fire safety education can't be valuable and important alongside psychosocial interventions or instead of. But we recognise that there has to be this understanding of different responses to, of course, meet different risk levels and different needs of children. And I introduced folks to my own research completed in 2020 as part of my thesis, which Matt very kindly spoke about in the introduction at the University of Cambridge, a master's thesis, but an 18,000 word tome, which it felt like when I was doing the research and the write-up. So a significant study that allowed for the first time an insight into what's the UK landscape for fire services when trying to identify risk and need in children who set fires, and this question of how do you identify those requiring psychosocial interventions when we have an absence of assessments and national guidelines. And that question sits as uncomfortably with other disciplines. Where are the guidelines, the benchmarks, the assessments that allow for more objective, research-based decision making? Those of you on screen may remember my research presented a very problematic picture currently in the UK. How could it not be if we have staff who can't turn to national guidelines, policies or assessments? Then we will, of course, be expecting our practitioners to be making decisions based in their experience, their professional judgment and their training. And whilst those things matter and are fundamental in defensible decision making, what's the knowledge of staff making these decisions, it of course allows for human error and bias. One person's training could be very different to another, and so it introduced a very inconsistent picture for the UK in the type of interventions being delivered to children who set fires by fire services. Inconsistencies range from the age of the child that is served through to staff that have no training, organisations that have no written policies, and of course, I've already mentioned defensible decision making. We make our practitioners and our organisations incredibly vulnerable when we don't support them in this way with rigorous training and written policies. In the absence of these support structures and assessments, it perhaps is also unsurprising that the literature identified a group of staff that question their professional identity, that others were experts, very much a case of referring on rather than sitting alongside a child and family through the other interventions and alongside other agencies that might be in place. And in a lack of recognition of the expertise of fire safety education that wasn't recognised often by staff and indeed national senior managers, then of course what we have is the emotional labour of this work, the masks we wear to present as professional, to hide our own feelings of fear, exhaustion, uncertainty, when organisations, managers, even peers don't really understand the work being undertaken, the professionalism that fire safety education is when used to address fire setting behaviour, then of course we have a staff group whose emotional labour, the hard work of working with children with complex traumas and heightened levels of emotional dysregulation, when it isn't being recognised, we have a workforce who in their own words talked about the pains of this work, which can paint a really bleak landscape. It is absolutely problematic, but the fact that nearly 700 the last time, over 700 this time, are potentially watching these discussions, hearing this research, maybe now is the time to indeed ask the questions of when are our assessments coming? How do we deliver standardization that allows for individual innovation and regional and country and continent differences, but allows for a consistency that keeps staff safe and keeps, of course, children and families safe. Didn't folks do a lot in 2 hours? I think in 2 hours, yeah, in 2 hours. And didn't we need the 2 weeks, I think, in between to maybe digest and reflect on some of this? And I did my own reflections in that time. I really like this image of the reflection, not only because there's fire in the picture, but when we reflect, when we look at our practice, maybe we don't always like what we see or what we hear. When I watched the 2-hour recording myself, oh, do I really sound like that? Did I actually say that? Yet that's how we learn. So we hold up a mirror to ourselves in our work. Of course we do. It's what practice demands of us. Whoever our clients are, whatever our discipline, we are reflective practitioners and clinicians. And when I reflected through the Q&A of the 2 hours, whether the questions answered on screen, put in the chat box, many of which were discussed at the time, but the ones that really made me think. And of course, our fatal fire set by a 9-year-old child in Illinois, of course, led to conversations and comments in the chat box. How could it not? A 9-year-old who sets a fire that kills 5 people in its own right is devastating enough. But when we consider that this child is now being charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, I think it really focused for us at the very start of the first webinar, the seriousness of what we do, and indeed why criminology matters in thinking about child set fires, because how do we construct notions of crime? A 9-year-old criminally responsible for 5 counts of first-degree murder. Given the level of interest, I've put together some links to this story, which Matt is going to put into the chat box for you. A couple of UK newspapers reporting on the story and one article from the Washington Post. Watching the webinar back, I realised my apologies. I said the 5 fatalities were 2 children and 3 adults. It's actually, I should have said, 3 children and 2 adults. So that was my mistake. The articles that you read are indeed correct. So do, if you have the opportunity, look in the chat box, copy the links. It's very sobering reading and a reminder of exactly why we work in these fields and carry the worries that we do about our decision making. There was an absolutely incredible question in the box, which after going through the research together, the literature, asked this is clearly systemic. We think about fire setting behaviour, the child, the family environment. And so I was asked in my own study, consider popular media representations and cross-cultural patterns. I answered the question at the time saying, sadly, it didn't, because the focus of my study was very much the practitioners. But I reflected at the time that, yes, my criminological lens and all our different discipline lenses, yet whose lens and story is this? How much of our research is dominated by the global north? Whose stories are we listening? Whose needs are we meeting? And so I was interested to think, right, okay, what is out there beyond the research I talked about, which was predominantly North America, Australia, New Zealand? It's very much a focus of today's literature again, but I came across two papers on Kenyan school fires, one a paper from 2014 by Cooper, which talked about arson, school arson, set by pupils as very much a political statement, and then a second paper from as recent as 2020 by Oburu and others, which again looked at the question of arson in Kenyan schools. And whilst there's typically more focus on gun violence within schools, they had done a review of newspaper reports on arson in Kenyan schools. So both were almost coming together, media representations and cross-cultural patterns. And the second paper put the motives for child set fires, these school arsons, much more in the terms of the conversations we had the last time about there are multiple motives here. There's no one single type of child setting fires for one cause only, that it was more nuanced and complex than political motivation alone. And so the question has allowed me to think wide about what lens do I look through in my research. And I don't know if it's a case of when we become aware of things, they seem to land in our lap, or is it that we're consciously looking for them? But Channel 4 News, which I know might, with the academic reputation of ACAM, seem a little, why is she referencing a news programme? But bear with me, a fascinating item in the intervening time we were together on the loyalist bonfires of Northern Ireland. So a recent celebration within Protestant culture, the Battle of Boyne. So we're talking 300 years ago, a Protestant victory. And of course, you can imagine that in 2021, these bonfires still stoke Catholic tensions. How could they not if you are living in a community where bonfires that are sanctioned have Irish flags being burned? And it's only a 4-minute piece, but is so incredibly powerful. And especially because a way of trying to make these bonfires literally less inflammatory for the different neighbourhoods within the area is that they've allowed what they call children's bonfires. And so Matt is going to put the link to the news piece in the chat box for you. And again, this is worth 4 minutes of your time, because have a look at the size and the scale of these children's bonfires. They are extraordinary. When they were being filmed, the camera crew had to move away because of the heat generated. I can't even put a size on it. They are absolutely huge. And teenagers in the news piece talk about it being, it's their culture, it's their street culture. And how they deemed them as children's bonfires is, yes, they've removed the flags of Ireland, the posters about Sinn Féin. Now, of course, Sinn Féin members, MPs, others consider these bonfires a hate crime, yet they are sanctioned. The police aren't present, but the fire service are. And what a powerful 4 minutes in how fire is used, the symbolism historically and today, and of course the insights it gives us to these teenagers building these fires. They have purpose, they have identity, they have something to do, they have a voice. And one of the teenagers whose interview says it's, in his words, fucking brilliant. It's something to do. And after, they get bored again. So what an extraordinary documentary, and all because of a question that was asked, the power of questions and the power of reflections. And another project that has come across my radar in our intervening weeks, again, it's not an academic research project, but one I think many of you on screen will be interested in. It's a project undertaken by a social documentary photographer. And he uses as his cultural reference the birds called firehawks in Australia. And it's been long documented, certainly verbally, amongst Australia's Indigenous peoples, that there are certain birds of prey that in bushfires will collect burning sticks to drop on other areas of dry grass to start another fire. That means small creatures, rodents, insects will start to flee, and they have their prey. Their survival is engineered and mastered through the use of fire. And what photographer Stephen King is doing is a project thinking of the parallels between this is an animal that manipulates its environment to survive through fire. What about children and teenagers who similarly manipulate their environments through fire to survive? For all the risks that we can see of the behaviour, it's maybe their way of support and nurture and survival. So again, Matt's going to do a fabulous job for me and put the link to the project in the chat box, because Stephen King is inviting participants, and that's participants who as children used to set fires, or participants because they are practitioners and clinicians and academics and researchers interested in the field of child fire setting, and inviting people to be a part of the initial research project that's part funded by Arts Council England and the Open Eye Gallery in Liverpool. And so it would seem that fire setting behaviour by children is on lots of people's radars right now. Last time I established a recent paper in the Lancet 2019 by Nicola Tyler and other authors, establishing fire setting behaviour as an international public health issue, and maybe enough of us are listening to this message and of course seeing it ourselves in our children and young people setting fires. A question I was asked at the time that I answered was around what is known about fire setting behaviour in children and fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And the question was very specific. Did the Kolko and Wernberg 2017 practitioner guide make reference? And I said, off the top of my head, I don't think it does. But I went away and I checked. And I checked every book on my shelf that's related to either adult or child fire setting, and no reference anywhere to FASD. And so I looked online and found one paper by Brown and others that spoke directly to both fire setting by children and fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And it was very reminiscent when I gave the explanation of what we know about children with autism and fire setting. The data isn't sufficient. Anecdotally, practitioners will talk about children with autism who set fires. children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders who set fires, but the data doesn't allow for any causal or relational link. And again, a little like autism, it was proposed that perhaps there are links between fire setting by children who have FASD because of those wider considerations we see generally in children who set fires. Their inability to regulate emotionally, difficulties with communication, potential lack of empathy and understanding consequences. So I'm sorry that I couldn't be any more informed around FASD, but I'm really glad it made me go in, think about, well, what do we know about this? Highlights again, we know less than we actually can work with, hence the thirst why so many of you are probably on screen to find out more. And then the main theme through the question and answers on screen in the box was very much resources. I was really struck by the overlap of practitioners working with children of all different needs, whether that's speech and language, special educational needs and disabilities, learning disabilities, and how do we adapt our messages. And I explained that today is going to be very much a consideration of the practicalities of, okay, what resources do we use? And of course, that key question of what works? A question that plagues many of us, whatever our discipline, whether it's about programs in prison, whether we are psychologists, criminologists, firefighters, other fire service personnel, all the beautiful and myriad disciplines represented on screen, we are plagued by the question, what works? And so we start to think about the work of the gentleman on screen, and I wonder how many of you recognise who admittedly in this picture looks pretty dodgy, given that he has hanging around his neck an ID. So this was when he took part in a prison study. So many of you on screen will recognise that this is indeed the US sociologist Robert Martinson, who in 1974 undertook a prison rehabilitation study, and in his findings commented, almost nothing works. This became misconstrued and taken as nothing works. And so we think again about language. Imagine being in a prison in 1974 and you have an eminent sociologist misquoted telling you nothing works. Imagine being the person who works in a prison, who delivers programs, who delivers rehabilitation, and you are told nothing works. And so this statement, incorrect though it was, because it was almost nothing works, ushered in a period of punitive responses to people in prison. Well, if nothing works, it's all about punishment. And so an almost drop in rehabilitation programs completely. The power of language, the power of the written word. Do we raise aspirations or do we completely decimate people and practitioners? But what it did do was galvanise the world of rehabilitation to say, right, we need to evidence that what we do works. And of course, that's what is underpinning so much of our practice on screen. We use our practical experience, our clinical experience and expertise, and sit that alongside the research of, well, what does the evidence say? What works? And in fire setting literature, limited though it is, for children setting fires, we are looking at two distinct types of intervention. Fire safety education, which is the majority intervention whether in the UK or overseas, that most children rather, who set fires will receive, and most typically delivered by fire services. There are, of course, those children who will need additional support in the form of psychosocial interventions. And of course, we mustn't forget that we can have both. And this is very much what happens within the adult fire setting interventions. Those of you on screen that may be familiar with the work of Professor Teresa Gannon at the University of Kent and the Forensic Psychology School, pioneering in adult fire setting research and treatment, have introduced the first standardized adult fire setting treatment programs for people in prison and secure hospital settings, based predominantly around cognitive behavioural treatments, the Good Lives model, the work of Tony Ward. Within this structured programme, there is also an element of fire safety education. And who delivers that fire safety education? It's not your psychologists, because fire safety education is a different expertise. Wherever the programme is being delivered, local fire services will be brought in to deliver their fire safety education as part of the standardised, structured intervention programme that people are receiving. And so we recognise indeed that fire safety education is a specialism. If it seems like I am repeating myself from last week and from today, it is deliberately so, because when my research highlights that senior managers nationally, senior managers within organisations and even teams locally aren't recognising their own professionalism and expertise, we need to elevate the status of this work, because the literature tells us it matters. It's the most dominant intervention. So we will get referrals from child and adolescent mental health and social care and youth justice, because we have a specialism that they can't deliver. And we will look to these same teams for their expertise around perhaps psychosocial interventions when we recognise there's an additional or further approach needed here. What fire safety education is all about, of course, is we're trying to target that child's curiosity, whether that's our young child, whether it's our teenage child. They are still children in law and still curious. And we're thinking about their exposure, their experience, our risk factors coming into play again here. What's a child's interest, access and exposure to fire? And how can fire safety education effectively address that? Through expert instruction. You'll see that there are references at the foot of the slide. You'll be given the presentation alongside the recording when available, and everything is fully referenced for you at the end. What you also have on screen is the front cover of my book. Thank you to so many of you in the chat box last time who asked, tell us more about your book, where did we get it, what's it called? So this is what it's called. So Matt, this is a good time please for the link to the book to go into the chat box. I don't mind if you go to the library and get it. Don't steal, but beg and borrow a copy, because you could say she's bound to say that. But in the field of fire safety education, this is one of the few, if perhaps only, books of its type that speaks to this work in a way that is accessible to parents, foster carers, practitioners, clinicians, rather than being an academic book, which we need, rather than being a clinical guide, which is suitable for clinicians. This aims to be accessible for anyone curious about, yes, why do children and teenagers set fires? Why do they do it? And how do we help? And lots of fire safety education strategies in here. Chapters, case studies, which we're going to think about together in the second half of today. But please do realise, in the very valid questions of last time, of what are the resources, how do we adapt them, there is a resource for you to have as a reference to think about, what might be suitable for this child and their need. We, of course, then think about psychosocial interventions, and on screen this time you see David Kolko's Handbook on Fire Setting in Children and Youth from 2002, and was and remains very much my Bible in this field when I first started, and is still a frequent reference point and go-to book. In here you'll find chapters on both psychosocial interventions and fire safety education, and presents the research around, okay, within psychosocial interventions, we're predominantly thinking about cognitive behavioural treatments where we're seeking to modify either the parenting practices, the child's own thinking and their behaviours, and of course the wider family function that's influencing a child's fire setting. And it talks about such techniques as graphing, which is one of the activities I'm going to show you later. And when I ran a training session once with a very well-established organisation in one of the Shire counties of England, so anybody unfamiliar with the geography of England, there's poverty everywhere, sadly. But there are certain counties of England which are more affluent. And when I talked about the graphing technique, I actually heard somebody in the audience turn to their colleague and say, "She means graphing." No, what I mean is graphing, okay? So potato, potato, tomato, tomato. I'm not going to even try and insult anybody with an American accent. Graphing, however you say it, that's the resource we are going to look at together. Really useful for our teenage audience. And even though it's presented as a psychosocial intervention, and I wonder if fire service are thinking, oh, hey, hang on, we're slipping into territory we don't know here, you absolutely can. And I explain how it can be used by clinicians and practitioners. It's why it's in my book. Of course, there will be pro-social skills and anger control, how our children learn and how they're taught these skills. There's problem solving, and it may be about individual or family psychotherapy. So we recognise that a child's fire setting needs can be more than fire safety education, but fire safety education will remain a component at some point. And so we return to the Kolko and Wernberg guide. And you can see that in this book, it takes basically all the three areas we have to consider and address directly. So fire interest, access, exposure. There's a whole chapter on fire safety education, even though this is a clinical book for clinicians, and it's suggested mental health practitioners of master's degree level and above. Hey, folks, get familiar with your fire safety education, or maybe work alongside your fire service colleagues, draw on their experience and expertise. These are the women and men that really understand fire and fire safety. And so the guide talks to fire safety education, which is why I recommend it for all practitioners and clinicians, regardless of what our titles and our training might be. It is, of course, thinking about the child's individual functioning and abilities, with, again, chapters dedicated to thinking about their thinking, their emotions. How do they problem solve effectively, and how do they be assertive in ways that are safe for them and others? And perhaps uniquely, as practitioner guides go, and certainly within fire setting behaviour and what's available or more not available, there is a section and lots of activities to work with families and carers as well. Building positive parent-child relationships. What do rewards look like? What do sanctions sound like? And so I can't advocate for these two books enough. Whatever your role, your experience, there are nuggets in here that, in the absence of so much, we look to the information that is available. And so, of course, I've given a nod to, well, there is so much that we still don't know. And there are big questions remaining about, okay, so fire safety education is recommended, psychosocial interventions are recommended. There's singular studies, limited studies of what works, but really, how do they work? These are the questions that remain often unanswered. How many sessions? Delivered by whom? Who is present? Is it child and parent? Parents on their own, child on their own? It's like so many of our questions about what works with different programs and interventions. It's that integrity of what's delivered, how it's delivered, the relationship, that so many questions remain still unanswered. And so we look to quite limited studies of the efficacy of both fire safety education and psychosocial interventions, but we work with what we have. And the one I'm sharing with you on screen is pretty exciting. If you're an anorak in the world of juvenile fire setting, this is about as exciting as it gets, because this is a 10-year follow-up study. So a rare longitudinal study looking at children who went through the New Zealand Fire Service fire setting program, their fire awareness and intervention program. It looked at, as you can see, 182 children that had completed the fire setting program. And where are they 10 years later? Straight away, we have the suggestion that this is a rigorous study. This will have demanded time, money, the buy-in, literally, of services outside of fire services to say, let's see where our children are 10 years later. It's about accessing criminal records. It's about accessing the records of social care. So undertaken by Professor Lamy and others. And look at what it says around those 182 children. Only 2% known for further arson offences. Yet overall, a general offending rate of 59%. We allow for the low detection, often, of arson. Yet, for other crimes, these children were coming to the attention of other agencies 10 years later at a level of 59% of the participants. And they ranged in crimes from what we might call petty crimes, although really, if you're a victim of crime, how petty is it ever? But theft, shoplifting, through to serious sexual offences. And again, serious sexual offences, aren't all offences that are sexual serious? Yes, they are. So doesn't language matter? But what it did convey, and the study conveyed it better than I am describing, is there was a range of offending behaviours here. And what the study advocates for, and which is what gets me excited, is because it not only advocates for fire services need to be undertaking assessments of need for children around fire setting behaviour. What is the risk of the fire setting? That then determines the content of intervention. Is it fire safety? Is it psychosocial interventions? So it recommends that, and that's no surprise. It's where much of the literature has sat since pretty much the beginning, about we need assessments to be rigorous. But what it also recommends is fire services introduce other types of assessments that can help identify children for other sources of support. And that is exciting, because that's putting fire services squarely at the heart. Squarely at the heart? Oxymoron? I don't know, you can think about that one. It's at the heart, it's the centre, it's the middle of the children's workforce. That fire services are no longer on the periphery, thinking of themselves as, are we professionals? No, the others are expert. We just refer on, we do a bit of fire safety, that's all. No, this can be a group of staff, because look at the families they're interacting with. This is early intervention. If this can be fire services identifying these children to other agencies, hence my excitement, that's recognising the role fire services can play in true early intervention. I'm really curious, given my research, to think what some senior managers nationally in fire services will think if they struggle with the idea of fire safety education being a professionalism. Perhaps they need to hold on to their helmet at the thought of you can be alongside your peers from mental health and education and youth justice and social care and be truly multi-agency and have formal referral pathways with service level agreements, because we've been part of the assessment procedure. Yes, it takes training, but when this is a skilled workforce anyway, that are expert in what they do, it's building on it. But before I get too carried away with what fire services could do alongside the importance of mental health and social care, all of us addressing this public health issue, let's perhaps ground ourselves in research that's maybe a little bit more typical for fire services, and let's start thinking about fire safety education compared to a one-off home visit from a firefighter compared with cognitive behavioural treatments. And this is the work of Kolko. So there he is on screen after all this talk of his books and his research for over 40 decades. I thought it was only fair to see the man on screen. And look at that face. Isn't that a face you'd want to take your children to if your child was setting fires? And I remember the first time I heard Professor Kolko speak with all his letters and, you know, I've got his Bible and this is the international lead. And would he be terribly intimidating because he's clearly brilliant? Would I even understand what he said? And he stood there and he is brilliant and clever and intelligent and a researcher and a clinician and yet accessible. And you can just imagine being a child or teenager rocking up to his institute with all the labels you've been given and thinking, actually, do you know what? Yeah, I could work with this person. The humanity that comes through the relationship that is allowed to be formed. And so we think about our smiling eyes when our children and teenagers work with us. If this is about thinking practically, we think about our language, what we say, what we write. We're the smiling eyes that children need to see. We know our children and teenagers need at least one adult to be unconditionally crazy about them. And if that isn't a person at home, then where else do they see smiling eyes, regardless of what they might have done and how worried and concerned we are for them and possibly others. And so in Kolko's 2001 study, I realise I'm taking you back 20 years, but don't the wheels of academia certainly move slowly, and certainly in our field. He did a comparison study of, let's take a one-off HFV, home visit from a firefighter, where it's about, this is what fire does, it's dangerous, one-off information sheets, jobs are good in. Then there's fire safety education, which is more long-term, more structured, more standardized, and there were the cognitive behavioral treatments, both FSC and CBT. However, the children, and they were boys aged from 5 to 13, were allocated, each received 8 sessions of either fire safety education or cognitive behavioral treatment. Interestingly, all at 1 year follow-up showed improvements on measures around fire involvement, fire interest, and fire risk, our fire risk factors. But when looking at measures for fire setting frequency, the severity of fire set and other fire-related behaviours, it was fire safety education and cognitive behavioural treatments that were more effective than a one-off home visit from a firefighter. It leaves us without questions of, well, what was in the 8 sessions of fire safety education? How was it delivered? How frequently? The same with our CBT, what was in the 8 sessions, delivered by whom, what areas, was it problem solving? But what it does perhaps suggest is that structured, long-term interventions that of course can allow for a relationship are more effective in impact on fire setting behaviour. And it makes us think of wider literature. One of the chapters in Colco's Handbook of 2002 talks about fire safety education and the skill of these practitioners to have knowledge grounded in child development and their skills to build relationships. And more recently, a meta-analysis study by Perks and others from 2019 recommended we need to be thinking about trauma-informed practice, because if so many of your children are coming through setting fires because of complex histories of trauma, because of elevated emotional dysregulation, often again attributed to early learning experiences and abuse, then of course we need to be thinking trauma-informed. So what I've done is start to widen the literature and think about this concept of, okay, how does child development relate to fire safety specifically? And what I've done is taken, in particular, Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development. I realise there are limitations to the work of Piaget. I draw also, of course, from Vygotsky and what we learned about play and how we scaffold children's learning. Excuse me. Of course, we draw on Skinner and notions of reward. How do we reward the behaviour change we see in our fire safety education work? But when faced with an absence of guidance, of frameworks, of literature that said, right, for this age, this is what you could do, I took Piaget's literature, his research around the 4 stages of thinking development, and put them into 3. So Piaget's 4 stages, many of you on screen will know this: our 0 to 2-year-olds, our 2 to 6-year-olds, our 7 to 12-year-olds, our 12-year-olds up. Thinking of fire setting behaviour, I grouped 0 to 7 together, so a world of sensory learning, of pre-operational, and thinking this is about children's literal thinking. So the fire safety message aligned to literal thinking would be stay away from fire. And then, of course, as children begin to have more logical thinking, that does take into account other people's perspectives, but not all possible consequences. I've built this notion of good versus bad fires. And when we think of our adolescents and their ability to consider hypotheses, understand more abstract ideas, those what-if scenarios, consequences without using that C word that shuts down most of our teenagers the minute you breathe it. This is how I have framed my practice to the research. Like all practice and research is open to critique, but it features in my book, and it is what guides me, that if children typically are at the stages of 5, of 9, of 14, these are the fire safety messages that I will use. And after the break, we're going to think about, okay, then, what does that practically look like in actual hands-on resources? So I'm just going to check my time. It's coming up to 15:09. So let's come back together in 10 minutes.
So this is a great opportunity for you to get your kind of questions in about that first session. So that'd be really good. You can put those into the Q&A facility there. If you're not sure how to do that, don't worry, just put it in the chat and then we'll draw those all out. So whilst we're waiting, I'm going to put some links into the chat that you might find useful. And also you can use the opportunity to kind of network.
Welcome back, folks. If anybody noticed me suddenly giggling then, it was because I saw Matt gave away a free membership to Neve, who replied first about being from Ireland. So I love it. Prizes on a Friday afternoon. Outstanding. We'll continue with our considerations about what does this research, fire safety education versus psychosocial interventions, look like in practice. And so I'll return to my presentations, and I've called this playtime, and that might seem odd, unusual, this risk critical behaviour. Some of our older teenagers, well, even as adults, we need play. We just play in different ways as we get older. And many of you on screen will be familiar with the work of Dan Hughes, who talks about the importance of playfulness in direct work with children and teenagers, regardless of the behaviours. And so can we step outside our adult selves and meet children at their level? And I saw one of the questions in the chat box was the Piaget's developmental stages. Yes, that's very much their thinking. So what is a child able to cognitively understand, typically? And so can we step outside our adult age and experience and meet the children emotionally in their thinking in order to be as effective as we can be? So I make no apologies here for introducing you on screen to images like colouring in and stress balls and jigsaws, because how do you have a conversation with a 0 to 7-year-olds, this big important message of stay away from fire? Our under fives are those most likely to die in accidental fires. So how do we even start that conversation about a fire? Well, maybe your fire engine jigsaw does it, or your board book of Peppa Pig or Maisie's fire engine. In Peppa Pig, Mum is a firefighter, so good positive representation from an early age of the jobs women, of course, we can do and have done for quite some time. And so maybe a board book or a jigsaw, as they read with you, do the jigsaw together, allows you to say, have you ever seen a fire engine? You've seen a fire engine? A fire engine came to this house. I wonder why a fire engine came to this house. That's how we start big conversations with our littlest of people who might be scared because they maybe realised something happened that was scary or not nice. And now this big, tall grown-up is looking at me and I have to explain. So we think of drawing and colouring, and make your paper and pens colourful. I realise places are on their knees, and that's polite in the wake of austerity, but I walk into some services for children and I think, where's the colour? Where's the play? Where's the coloured paper? Where's the coloured pens? Not one sheet of white paper and one biro. And of course, it's about what we bring, but if we are going to do this work properly, then we resource it accordingly. And we enter children's worlds through colour and play and things that are tactile and on their level. So we think about in our repertoire, whatever our discipline, that if we're working with children as young as, I'd say 3 in my resource packs, from 3 to 7 years before that, it's all about working with the families. It still is at older ages, but younger children, of course, it's about the parents learning that they are fire safety education. How do we get these messages across? We've got in our repertoire the jigsaws, the colouring books, the storybooks, the general storybooks of going on a bear hunt, the classic favourites, wherever you are internationally, stories that represent our children, children that can see themselves in the stories they read and allow us introductions then, of course, to what happened in the fire. And one of the main resources I will recommend, why is there a robot on screen? What has that to do with fire safety education and staying away from fire? So one of the main resources I will advocate for in this age group is the yes, I can play, no, stay away game. If you trained with me, worked with me, read my book, this is a staple. And how could it not be? Picking up on all the questions around language last time, limited language, limited understanding. Basically, what we are talking about is a series of flashcards. Make them big and shiny, okay? So here's my hand-drawn robot. I wish I was that good at art, made by a colleague many years ago, but has lasted the test of time. And so what we do, what you do, is build, there's ideas in the book, a series of A4 colourful, laminated, wipe clean easily flashcards of stuff you'll find in someone's home, of what children can play with and what they can't play with. So there's ideas for you on screen. Toys they can play with, candles, matches, lighters, scissors, anything that's dangerous. But rather than those big words, dangerous, age 4, we use rhythm. We use rhyme. So take your A4 cards, you're sat on the floor with your children, of course you are, you're entering into their world, and all the cards are face down, and you ask them to point to one, and they've pointed, and you turn it over and you go, what's this? And they'll go, robot. It is a robot. Can you play? Now, even if they're unsure, they're going to hesitantly go yes, because of course I am going. Can you play? I am smiling, I am nodding. My tone of voice is saying, can you play? And they'll maybe go yes. And you go, yes, you can play. And you physically hand this card to the child. Oh, and they've got something now. It's like, oh, this game's okay. They pick again. And maybe this time, whatever your images are, what's this? So my tone has changed. I'm frowning. Do they know it? So target your cards to the child's fire setting or fire play. Is it candles? Is it matches? Is it lighters? Is it a cooker? Whatever your concern, and this is why this could be adapted for an older age that has a limited understanding or limited language, because there's no words here. And maybe to make it more suitable for a teenager, make them like playing cards. So you're not treating a teenager like a child, but meeting their need. But if I'm with my 0 to 7s, what's this? Oh, fire. It is fire. Can you play? And again, they're going to say no, because my tone, my body language, they're going to copy. Young children are the best imitators. They're often copying the behavior they see around fire that isn't safe. So we teach a different. Can you play? No, no, stay away. And so I will keep the card. You will keep the card. Mum, dad, whoever the grown-up is, if it's something they can't play with, stay away. We keep it. And there's the game. It can go on as long as you want it to, because of however many images you create. And I know I'm going to say this because I created this, but kids love it. It's bizarre when you think of the worlds our children are in, of the best technology. I can't compete with that. And we shouldn't even try, because what they need from us is something different. Smiling eyes that play games, and you play it over and over, because when you've reached the end, and maybe there was 5 images of each, so they've got 5 cards, you've got 5 cards, and you count up and say, how many cards do you have? 1, 2, 5. You had 5 things right. You're clever. Should we play it again? And of course, I'm going to play it again because it's rhythmic, it's repetitive. Children learn through doing. Oh, hey, I'm good at this. Mastery. I know what's coming next. Why do children ask the same story over and over and over again in this age group? Because they know what's coming, and it makes them feel important, and they're starting to understand the world around them. And so I cannot endorse enough. It's cheap as chips to make. You need some white paper, images either drawn or sourced online, laminate so they're reusable, and you play it over and over. Place the cards face down again and the same. Can you play? And if you read the book, I hold on with pride to the child in the book. I talk about the case study in South London who, when they saw me at the bottom of the stairs, went, "No, stay away," in a Welsh accent. Matt's South London earlier in the chat box, a South London child looking, going, "No, stay away," and not to tease. He'd played the game so much with me, he was even copying, "No, stay away." And so at times when we struggle for resources, the cost of things, trying to compete with the latest gadget gimmick, take it back to basics. It's simple, it's powerful, and it picks up on a really important question in the Q&A box that asked about the children in the New Zealand fire study, the longitudinal study. Of those 180 plus, how many had previous fire setting? 101 children in that study had previous fire setting. The rest, it was their first fire setting. I don't know the exact number, detail of the previous fire setting, but the real nub of the question, and which I really liked because it picked up from the conversation of last time, is let's not pathologise what's natural curiosity. We're concerned because it's a risk. Of course it is. But we don't pathologise, we don't need to medicalise. These children are curious about fire, and we meet that curiosity by teaching messages of no, stay away. And then when you think of the different books that are available internationally around children's fire safety, link them. If they've played No, Stay Away with you, and now you're reading a book, and there's a fire, what do we say? And these little voices say to you, "No, stay away." If you do home visits and you've played this a few times in your sessions, take the children into the kitchen the next time. As a cooker, can you play? Do you see the things that they will see, and they know now to stay away? And that's exactly how this game grew. 3-year-olds, twins, who were causing fire through the cooker in the kitchen. There's no intent. There's no desire to harm. There's no understanding of consequences. They're copying what they see others in the family do. Oh, turn these knobs, put things on top, and then walk away. That's how their fires were starting. And when I read general fire safety books with them in our first session, they liked the story. They're 3 years old, connecting the story about a match to a cooker in a kitchen. That's a big leap for a 3-year-old. And I remember speaking to a colleague saying, "I'm really worried they're not getting basically that they need to stay away." And the game was born. That's it. A message that teachers stay away. We don't pathologise, we're not medicalising. It's fire safety education that, of course, how many clinicians on screen could do. Our mental health workers, our psychiatrists, our psychologists, all of you who are interested and responsible in this field, this is absolutely within our agency. Literally, it's within our organisations to do this work, and it's certainly within our capacity. And it's us being playful, and it's us meeting these children at their level. We only have 2 hours on screen together. This is where I'm going to point you to my book, a whole chapter dedicated to 0 to 7 years. I can't give you all this in 2 hours, but this I always have as my staple in this category, a stay away from fire message. This is what I will play with them over and over again. And they'll often ask, "Have you got the game? Have you got the game?" Yes, we've got the game. Shall we play it again? Absolutely, we shall. And they're rewarded with stickers at the end for how well they played and how clever they are, and all those things that make our children grow and remember. So lots of beautiful, lovely ideas to be thinking of with our 0 to 7-year-olds, and there's plenty more in the book, in the chapter, and in the various case studies. And so we think about our 8 to 11 years, and I've suggested this now is about a more logical, well, there's good and there's bad fires. Maybe it's birthday cakes and candles and barbecues and safe firework displays and cooking, and how could this become a bad fire? So we're starting to widen the message. It's still basically stay away from fire, but with more detail. And of course, for fire safety practitioners on screen, and which is where other practitioners listen to what your fire service colleagues can bring to you in joint working, this is absolutely where we teach our children fire safety messages of what are escape plans in school and in home. What number do you call for the fire brigade? Role play with a child what to say, what they will be asked. Do they understand about under the smoke so they don't choke? All these escape plans, ideas, life-saving skills that are your fire service's bread and butter. Either as clinicians learn them, or get your fire safety experts in who are trained to work with children and teenagers who set fires to give them messages that are needed alongside additional work you might be doing. But again, we need to be careful here that we're not maybe pathologizing or medicalizing. Yes, of course, we are now much more in an area where a child might be setting fires because it's their voice. See me, hear me. You won't ignore me now, I've set a fire. So, of course, we are thinking about, is there a higher functioning for the fire setting? Absolutely. Is it about other agencies around the table? That could be for child protection, safeguarding, for our psychosocial interventions. But of course, we have fire safety education in there. And again, we keep it playful. It's still about colouring and word searches and making someone the fire safety officer for their home. Do you make a paper helmet, like in my book, far more environmentally friendly than a plastic one? Or do they have a sticker or whatever, the certificate that says they're the fire safety officer, that when they've learned fire safety messages with you, that you trust them. A big person trusting me to remind the tallest person in the house to test the smoke alarm, or to practice the escape plan, or I've got permission to shout as loud as I can when we practice fire, when I'm usually told to be quiet. And these children will grow with a safe responsibility because we've allowed them to learn with us that there's good versus bad fires and how we keep safe at home from fire. And of course, I couldn't possibly talk about this age group without my absolute favourite for this age group. I've used this book with teenagers when the question came into the chat box about what's the developmental age here. I've worked with teenagers who emotionally are stuck because of trauma, abuse and neglect. And I've allowed them to read a children's book with me by saying, look, the next time we meet, I'd really like to read my favourite book with you. It's a children's book, but I love it. And I wonder if it'd be okay for you to let me read it with you. So I'm asking a permission. Is it okay? It's my favourite book as an adult. And so there's a permission about, all right then. And of course, by this point, I've built a relationship and I want to share something that's really precious to me. Could I share it with you the next time? So we can adapt our messages and our resources to teenagers, to learning disabilities, to communication difficulties, because it's about their story and their needs, not ours. But if we're thinking more typically of our 8 to 11-year-olds, you tell me an 8-year-old or through to 11-year-old who doesn't like the story of a dragon and a hamster, and there's the bones of this story. It's a brilliant book. It is literally a big book. Look at the size of this. And so children, when you bring it out of the bag, the red, oh, what's this? Even if they want to ignore you because they're too cool, actually, they can't help it, especially if you just start reading it yourself. Oh, no, I'm going to read this, and if you want to join me, you can, but that's okay, I'm going to read it anyway. Who wants to be left out? And it's brilliant. It's basically the story of Jez, a boy who's having his best day. It's a Friday. He's done his favourite book in school, which is The Dragon's Tale. He's built a paper dragon, and he even gets to take home the school hamster. Could his day get any better? But of course, what happens is Jez is in his bedroom, and there's lots of really fabulous illustrations throughout. The kitchen scene. If you have a child with no language, the centre spread of this book is minimum words and a big kitchen of all the stuff that can harm us as children, as adults, fire safety and otherwise. Lots of different messages. The teaching notes that come with the book give detailed ideas for how to talk about fire safety, talk about Welsh culture, where the book is set, talk about literacy. So whether you are in education, in mental health, this book can work for you and with you. And when Jez is in his bedroom that's got overloaded plug sockets, he starts to think, wouldn't it be good if my dragon started to breathe fire? And subtly you'll notice the hamster, who's the cleverest character throughout. She paints, she eats biscuits, she's debonair and wonderful. And her expressions change. As he starts to think about making his dragon breathe fire, taking matches like a thief in the night, the expressions on the hamster change. And there's a superb page in the middle where Jez has one match and the hamster looks frightened. And it's our opportunity to say, what do you think the hamster is feeling? And the moment the fire starts in the book, the hamster disappears. What might have happened to the hamster? And you get the children go, is he dead? Or is he dead? And so we have to find out. And I'm going to not do a spoiler alert here. You'll need to buy the book or speak to a colleague who's got the book. Does the hamster survive? Would I be so cruel as to ever introduce a child to a book that's a traumatic ending? So possibly the suggestions are there that everyone is physically okay after fire, but hey, emotionally, maybe. What's Jez going to say when he goes back to school on Monday and he hasn't got his dragon and the book anymore, and he no longer lives at home because of the fire at home? So again, a great book that even if we've got concerns around parenting and this child's individual needs, we can still bring in fire safety education that is playful and wonderful, and we can all read stories, and with teaching notes there's almost no excuse not to have this in your repertoire. And Matt's very kindly going to put a link in the chat box as to how to get hold of this book. And though it is set in the South Wales Valleys, this has been sent to fire services in the United States, in Australia, and New Zealand. So don't think of it only for Welsh children. I've only ever used this book in England, and children connect, because Jez is just a kid who made a bad decision, and we've all done that wherever we live and whoever we are. And then we move on to our 12-year-olds, and it's those activities like, do you play cards together to start a conversation? I spoke last time about Jenga or tumbling tower, and a numbered tumbling tower, because you might have a game of Jenga just because, or you might have corresponding cards. And if they pull out card brick number 15, do you have any brothers and sisters? So the green cards, these are all in the book for you as ideas and questions. Green cards, all about you. So be prepared. You can answer these questions. They're safe information for us to share with our teenagers. And then the red ones, of course, are around fire safety. What are the three parts of the fire triangle? So I'm a big advocate still for teenagers of playing games. Play cards, play buckaroo, but play Jenga just because, or play Jenga or tumbling tower with a purpose. Get to know each other. For all the more pressing needs that might sit alongside fire safety education for men of our teenagers, that they're requiring our cognitive behavioural approaches, that the power of a game and someone being curious and still imparting fire safety knowledge is still super important. And this is where absolutely clinicians know your fire services, know your peers in fire services. No one will speak fire science better than someone trained, an expert in fire safety. So the image on screen, it's a static image. This is a fire in a living room at 8 minutes, 30 seconds. It requires skill and knowledge to talk about what's happening here, that the smoke itself starts to burn, the cyanides and poisons that are in fire. Now, of course, you're going to judge, our professional judgment. This might be too evocative, maybe too provocative. for a teenager we are working with. All the time we're thinking of the individual child and their needs. But fire science, the what ifs, let's imagine what could happen. Let's think about, I wonder what, maybe rather than the consequences are the lecture, lead our teenagers to think about, okay, so this is what can happen in a fire. So let's think about, you need your fire service personnel for that level of fire safety knowledge, or someone like myself who specialises in this field. And of course, then we think about, okay, if we've talked about the what ifs and what could happen, and let's imagine, and I wonder what, we can absolutely talk with our teenagers about the fires that have happened. And this is where the graphing technique is so powerful. It's listed as a psychosocial intervention, but we can absolutely use it as fire safety educators and practitioners. And basically what it's doing is thinking about the ABC of behaviour, the antecedent, the behaviour, the consequence. I'm using the C word, but it's for us, not our teenagers. So the antecedent, everything that happened before. In this instance, it's the fire. And where I would never say to a child, I'm going to talk to you about the incident, like you can see on screen. It's a reminder that you can use this for all types of scenarios. When they hit their brother, when they spat at their teacher, whatever the incident, the behaviour, the ABC model, why is it so tried and trusted? Because it's effective. And so what we do is we'll have met with our teenager a few occasions already. We've built up a rapport, we've gone through fire science together, whatever your work looks like and sounds like. And now we're at a stage where, yes, absolutely, I want to talk about the most recent fire that I've been told about. And what I'll do is I'll ask them to talk me through that day. What's the first thing you can remember that day? And I will take notes at this stage. I rarely ever take notes when I work with a child or teenager, but I'm taking notes because I'm alongside them, they can see what I'm writing, and I need this as a prompt. I'll explain to them, look, I'm going to write down some pointers of what you say, because then we're going to talk about them a bit more. So tell me the first thing you can remember that day. And so we're basically having a conversation of all that led up to the fire. Then, of course, what happened during the fire, and all those natural conversations we'd have about who was at home when you first woke up, or was anybody else there when you set the fire? This doesn't become an interrogation, it's a conversation, helping us to understand in order to help them to understand. And then, of course, the consequences. So tell me what happened after the fire. I'm sat with you. That's one thing that's happened. But what happened immediately after? And they've told you all this. And along the way, you'll have said, can you remember what you were thinking then? Or what were you feeling when that happened? We're getting into thoughts and feelings, which we've written down. And then when we've got the story of the day, our ABC, or the incident, the most recent, and then perhaps we might move on next time to the most serious fire setting. That's our judgment, how we want the conversation and relationship to build. We plot it on a graph. So along the bottom are all the events. So we might need a big piece of paper, draw it out. Don't be worried about perfection of a graph. It's the visual image for your young person to see. And they've talked about, oh yeah, I was really fed up then, or I was bored, I was so angry. They've told you about these different emotions, and you give a colour or a symbol to each emotion, and you ask them to think about, oh, right, so you're really angry, you say. So what's really angry on 0 to 10? If 0 is nothing and 10 is the most, what were you then? Oh yeah, it was a 10, Joanna. It was straight away, it was a 10. And so, of course, by looking at the example on screen taken from the Colquhoun-Wernberg book, so it's there for you as a reference to read more around. In my book, there's a section on how you use this activity. You can see in this example, so it started with my mother yelled at me. And do you know what? I went straight up. I was like, right, anger number 10. I was put on punishment. And do you know what? That's when I started to think about setting a fire. And I thought about it a bit more. Oh, and then as soon as I'd set it, I tried to put it out. And then I woke my mother because I didn't want the fire. And what these activities do is allow our young people and us to recognise there's triggers. So that's what happened. That was the moment. And it's really interesting if you read the Kolk-Wernberg chapter on this, it talks about common themes, that when the graphing technique is done with young people setting fires, common themes are that just before the fire, they were either understimulated, they were on their own, or they just had an argument with a parent or a peer. And then some of the very typical emotions were loneliness, boredom, anger, and frustration. And if those of you on screen from fire service thinking, yeah, but what if I identify this kid's all about, yeah, it's the anger, and well, that almost becomes in itself an assessment to think, okay, so this is about when you get really angry, and we need to think about who can help you when you get really angry, because we need to keep you safe. So is it our story that allows us to see, oh, this is about anger, which might need a different kind of intervention? Or is this about being really lonely and scared? And this is a child protection issue, potentially. A child on their own, scared, lonely. How often does this happen? Has this happened before? And so the power of a pen, someone being curious, asking, talk me through the day, tell me what happened, who was there, how are you feeling, what did you think then? Oh, can you remember? Plotting it down, asking somebody, on 0 to 10, how guilty, little bit guilty or really guilty. And you'll find your own ways to have these conversations. You can see I'm very expressive. But however you deliver it, with those smiling eyes and that professional curiosity, we'll start to identify, okay, so this is what's happening when you're setting fires, and how empowering that can be for our teenagers to realise, oh, it's not me just like losing it, or, well, maybe it is losing it, but I'm losing it for a reason. And that in itself is incredibly empowering. And so again, go to the book for the chapter on teenagers, the chapter on our 8 to 11-year-olds, for all the ideas. There's even dominoes in there, there's dice in there. Get creative, get playful. It doesn't detract from the seriousness of what we do, but why not make it enjoyable for us and for those we work with? And when we think of enjoyment and we think of closure and bringing this conversation to an end, to conclude, I bring us back full circle to thinking about criminology and my discipline and the lens I look through. And criminologist Shad Maruna talks about the rites of passage. He quotes Mary Douglas, who talks about that in life, there are only certain things that happen through ceremony, ritual, and processes. Marriage, graduation, even death. The rituals, the ceremonies, the processes. And Shad Maruna asks, well, what are the rites of passage, the processes, the ceremonies, the rituals, when people come back into society after prison? Because Durkheim says how rites of passage, ritual ceremonies give a sense of belonging, a sense of order and structure. How do we reintroduce people in prison to their society after coming out of prison? And it made me think, well, what are our rites of passage for our children and teenagers when they stop setting fires? That's often quite a journey they've been on with us to become fire safe. The CBT they'll have done with you, the fire safety they've done with you, both maybe. How do we celebrate that? And I'm a big fan of the 3 C's. It's in the book. I'm a fan of a cake, of a card, and a collage. And if you haven't got the time for a collage, a certificate. And look at the image that came up when I put into a search engine, teenager with a certificate. A teenager with a certificate for having a COVID vaccination. That's been our children and teenagers' backdrop, context, everyday living for a year and a half at least. And so aren't our children and young people deserving of play and celebration when they come to the end of our work and they're safe? So think about the certificate that rewards, the cake that you share together, the nurturing of food that is shared. There's a cake for every kind of allergy and dietary restriction, okay? And leave a card. And this isn't about blurring boundaries. Oh, you're becoming too attached. Nonsense. Ridiculous notion that these children won't attach to us. They have to. If we are repairing trauma, it's only through good relationships can we repair the harm of a bad relationship. So it's a safe attachment that has a managed, safe ending that celebrates all that they have achieved. And yes, it's going to be sad not working with you anymore, but it's because you're safe. And you don't need to see me anymore. And I'll still think of you and I'll still wonder if you're all right. But you, look what you've achieved. And again, whatever words you use. So celebrate and don't underestimate writing a card, a postcard to someone that says, thank you for working with me. Good luck for the future. How many times do our young people hear professionals say, thank you for working with me and good luck? And who knows where that card might end up? On a notice board, in a book, in a drawer, but a reminder of, yeah, I did all right there. I did okay. And so that is my conclusion of how we turn research into practice. And in the time left, I can see the chat box and the Q&A have gone busy. So as ever, be curious. Curious George this time. Curious George and the firefighter story. Our permission again. Be playful and always be curious. And use the research that is available to be creative and hands-on in the work that we do with our children and teenagers.
Brilliant, Joanna. Thanks very much. I'm sure everyone got a lot from that. So we've got a few minutes left. Let's go through some questions, if that's okay with you.
Of course.
So, the first one is an anonymous one, and it's where to seek supervision for young adults in the absence of family supervision and with limited or no state provision who have started showing signs of fire starting.
When, oh gosh, this is difficult because it's an anonymous question. When they say supervision, as in physically where these young people might live, who literally looks after them?
No, yes, the example given is a teenager transitioning into adulthood, but they don't have the support networks that might normally, in inverted commas, be there with family members and state provision.
So who is around this young person then? Who are the professionals? And don't we think of young people, especially as they transition between services, ping-ponging, oh, it's not us anymore, it's you now, or it's not me, we haven't got the funding. At some point, someone needs to take responsibility. And if it's around fire setting behaviour, then the argument should be robust enough to say, if we've got concerns about fire, that's this person's safety and others. So who is in contact with this young person? Who knows what they are doing? Where indeed are they living? Who lives around them? And it's that classic, there's no one easy answer here, but it's about how do we keep young people on our radars, and especially if they don't have a family network, our children coming out of care, what's their network? Then it's, I think, a really good question that perhaps we all need to think about going forward is how do we keep in mind these children who transition into adult services, and what does provision look like, and what does family look like? And maybe we have to construct our answers around need on the potential risk, but not to demonize or close down the options for a safe home, but what indeed does a safe home look like for this young person?
So we've
what
got
a question.
A couple of questions relating to schools. The first one is from Adepeju, who's wondering about whether this form of teaching is part of the curriculum in preschools.
Form of teaching as in fire safety education in preschools. Now, this will depend very much from fire service to fire service, school to school. Interestingly, Research into fire safety messages for very young children, our preschoolers, was actually carried out by the production company for Sesame Street. Because, of course, Sesame Street has, over the years, so many different safety messages. They have characters now. We have characters with autism on Sesame Street, and they looked about fire safety messages for children. And the decision was taken not to have fire safety messages because they couldn't. It makes me think of the previous question about the family who's in the background. They couldn't guarantee that if children were watching this at a very young age without an adult to say no, stay away, or the equivalent, if what they see on screen is Big Bird or Oscar, whoever, with a match or a lighter, they might go, oh, I've got one of those in the kitchen, and copy. That they couldn't have a confidence that the fire safety message, listened to by little eyes and ears without an adult to give it a wider context, might give a very different message. And so I think that's very poignant for us when we think of, well, who are our preschoolers? What messages do they get? And often you'll find fire services messages with preschoolers are much more around firefighters are our friends and making emergency services accessible generally rather than specific fire safety education.
So in relation to schools, are there any particular behaviours that teachers should be looking out for as warning signs?
Oh, these questions are fantastic. It's like another workshop in its own right. So take it back to our risk factors, and especially the one around fire interest, access and exposure. Does a child talk about fire a lot? Do they maybe draw it? And I'm not, as you know, I'm not a art therapist, but if something is present in a child's life, they'll communicate it in different ways. What they talk about, how they play, what they draw. So I would be curious around, what's this child playing, saying, doing, maybe potentially acting out? And of course, if a family has had a fire, that might be difficult for a school to establish. But I would be thinking, definitely, is there anything around a child, what they say, what they do, that perhaps suggests fire is quite present to them? And I am mindful of a serious case review into a child that died in the north of England. In fact, 2 children died in the fire set, not by the child, but by a family member. And it transpired through the serious case review and the criminal prosecution that one of the family members was indeed setting deliberate fires constantly, almost. All different organisations didn't share information and realise this is what's happening, and the common denominator is this family member. Like so many serious case reviews, it's a really difficult report to read. And so whilst none of the children were setting fires, one of the children, when they spoke to the different agencies involved, the school did comment on one of the children talked a lot about fires at home, drew fires, and on one occasion did come into school with a lighter. And one of the recommendations was, yes, that staff need to be curious around what children are saying around fire. So I can't say enough how important that question is, and thank you so much for asking it.
So is there a connection between those children that have been diagnosed with ADHD, that they may be more interested or curious in setting fires than atypical children?
It's the big question, isn't it, about why is this over-representation of children with ADHD who set fires? Currently, the data is inconclusive. It sits more around, well, it's linked to lack of consequential thinking, of impulse control, rather than interest in fire itself. But what that question does make me think of is children with autism. I know we're talking about a different behavioural need here and disorder, that word, but often I've had cases referred to me for children with autism, and he's fascinated with fire. And we know children with autism, as adults with autism, can have obsessions. It's maybe the time when their mind stops worrying, that's their world of sense and calm and structure. And actually, in some of the cases I've had, it's not fire that's been the obsession, it's the action associated with it. So for one child, it was the clicking constantly of the ignition button on the cooker. So it was that repetitive sound, noise, action. And for another, it was the repetitive clicking action of a lighter. Now, of course, they both had an outcome of causing a fire, but the obsession wasn't fire, flames, it was the action. And so that question just made me think of that, about what's actually happening. And when we've got the, sorry, my apologies, I was distracted then by a question that came into the box, my apologies. So when we have the data not giving us clear indications of, well, what are these links, the overrepresentation of ADHD? What about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders? What about autistic spectrum disorders? In the absence of a grounded evidence base, think more than about the individual. What might it mean for this individual? Is it their lack of consequential thinking? Is it their lack of impulsivity? And maybe that is indeed worsened by a lack of supervision at home, or their own curiosity in fire. So when we have the absences in the literature, take it to the individual and what's their evidence of what's happening.
So just a couple of more questions. We're a little bit over time, but I'm sure people can hold on for a little bit longer. So Egbert asks, can loss and trauma at a young age contribute to fire setting behaviours?
Children who set fires have often early traumas, early abuse and neglect, often chronic abuse and neglect. Again, we're back to, you know, isn't all abuse pretty, but chronic, people will understand what is meant by that, that enduring, long-term, persistent. And so what we don't know is, well, was it the trauma that led to the fire setting? But it is typical for children setting fires to have had early histories of abuse that remain as complex traumas through their very early and young lives.
Fantastic. Two questions to go. So we've got a question here relating to apps. I'm going to extend this to online games or education as well. So are there any relevant apps or online education games / tools that children could interact with in a journey to help them better understand about fire starting?
I must admit that some of the apps that are created look, because we're talking about often public sector organisations with limited budgets, when they create apps, they can sometimes be quite clunky, that if you show them to a child or teenager, they're going to go, what's that? So I often steer away from apps because, as you've seen in my way of working, I like to get creative, hands-on, give a different approach. But of course, there are children, it will be how they learn. And so I don't currently know of ones that I could say, oh, actually, there's this app, look at this. This would be about our own individual searches online to see what is available. I know that's incredibly unhelpful, but again, it's this mirror held up of our dearth of literature, dearth of resources. And so what I would say is look to see what's out there, be your own barometer of the quality of message and what it actually looks like. Does it work for you or could it work against you? And I'm always open to being told if there's something and I don't know about it. I'm always learning still, especially with online work. So if anybody does have a recommendation, they could put in the chat box or let me know separately, then that would be very, very welcome indeed. None of us are ever too big to have a recommendation.
Philip makes reference to something you said in the last session about children being labelled as arsonists, even though they may have caused a fire many years ago. He asked whether this fire setting could be a phase that some children will pass through without any intervention, whereas others with other phases of curiosity which do not imply pathology.
Yes, absolutely. We have to always be thinking as best we can, what is the behaviour being communicated here? And if it is curiosity, and even if it's about, look, see me, hear me, notice me, that's a problem with the environment, not the child. So I'm always a big advocate of, let's not pathologise, but let's be open to all hypotheses, absolutely. And you make me think of, again, my criminological perspective of what we know. It is pretty much unchanged in 2 centuries now, about the age crime curve, that adolescence sees crime, offender behaviour peak, and then it drops off. And so it is often commented, if you want to keep kids out of the adult justice system, keep them out of the youth justice system. And I know that can seem terribly harsh and unfair on our brilliant youth justice service workers, but there is something about, are we criminalising what is actually adolescent risk-taking? Are we criminalising, are we pathologising unnecessarily? And that, again, is a really challenging and I think brilliant nuance of this behaviour, that it can fit into so many domains and diagnoses, and perhaps sometimes as practitioners we have to put the brakes on our own, maybe risk, aversion and fear of what could happen, to think about what is this behaviour, and let's absolutely not label beyond what is a curiosity behaviour. Colco tells us fire play is typical enough to be considered usual because of curiosity of fire by children.
We're a little bit over time now, so we're going to have to draw it to a close. But I'm going to put Joanna on the spot here and ask whether she'd be part of an ACAM podcast where we can talk about this in kind of more detail, answer some of the questions that we haven't been able to do. So if you're up for that, Joanna, over the next kind of few months, we can sort something out. Does that sound good to you?
Matt, you had me at podcast. Absolutely, absolutely. And isn't it always the way? When so few questions had come in at break time, I thought, all right, well, let's extend the discussions on resources, because that might be the more valuable use of time. But of course, then it's like those door handle moments social workers talk about. The last few minutes, the questions come, and I don't want to ever leave anyone hanging. So yes, let's do that, Matt. A podcast where we go through the questions. Absolutely brilliant idea. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So on behalf of ACAM, I'd just like to thank Joanna. So we hope to have this session up next week. You'll all be sent an automated email to tell you where it is available. And I'll also put something in there about if you wanted to ask any further questions to Joanna, and then we can incorporate that into this podcast. So thanks again. Thanks for joining from all over the world. Have a great weekend and have a great kind of summer going forward. But please, above all, keep safe, keep well, and we'll see you very soon. Thanks very much. Bye.